Welcome to you that have joined so far, high leverage practices in special education. So that's what our session is going to be about today. And we're just going to talk through what those practices are and the four areas in which they're divided, and then talk about good instructional strategies. So the book that I shared with you came from the Council for Exceptional Children in partnership with the Cedar Foundation. So groups come together and they wanted to really think about what are the most effective practices or the ones that yield the highest gains for us in teaching. And so you can see on the screen, that's what the high leverage practices are. They are practices for special education and help for school leaders and school teachers, practitioners around those areas to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. So they really put this work together. It was a lot of research and a lot of behind the scenes work to collect and put together the practices that they know that are most effective. And so they're divided into four areas for high leverage practices. And the first one is around collaboration. And I'll just mention those a little bit about what those are, and then we'll move, because we're going to specifically look today at instruction. But when we think about collaboration, it's really about how do we collaborate with other professionals to support students? How do we organize and facilitate effective meetings with other professionals and with families? And then the other component of that is how do we collaborate with families to make sure that we get the supports that we need for students? So there may be times when we collaborate with other related service providers, or we may have visually impaired or hearing impaired teachers we collaborate with. We collaborate all the time with other general ed teachers, and we collaborate with parents. So really the areas around high leverage practices are talking about how do we look for other partners with the goal in mind to support students with disabilities. So that's the big rock around collaboration. And then assessment is that, we understand the practices around what are good, using multiple sources of information to help understand a student's skills and strengths. We use assessment to help us design the educational program. And then we use assessment to analyze what our teaching practices are to see if those are working, or if we need to change our practices, or if the specially designed instruction that we've selected to support the student in a goal is the correct one. So those are big rocks around assessment. And then the next component is the social, emotional, and behavior. And so with the social, emotional, and behavior, we're talking about that consistent learning environment. That is, it's a respectful, organized learning environment that's conducive for learning for students. There's also that piece around feedback and how important that positive and constructive feedback is to deliver students around behavior. And we teach social skills, and we have functional assessments to help to support students around the area of behavior. So if that's something that you wanted more information or learning around, you could look at that section of the high leverage practices. So the last section then is instruction. So the purpose for today is to really look at that level of instruction and how can we impact instruction. So there are actually 22 high leverage practices. So the first three are around collaboration. The next three are around assessment. There are 4 around social, emotional, and behavior. And then the remaining of the 22 practices are listed all under instruction. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about those. But when we start thinking about how do we support students with disabilities, and we are thinking about goals, we think about specially designed instruction, it's really, really important that we have a good understanding of what those practices are that we know are evidence-based or research-based. Because sometimes it's hard for us to understand exactly where to go to get research-based practices, or to understand what high leverage practices are. So it's good that we have resources that can kind of help us know what to use when we're in a situation where we see that a child needs some extra support. What are those go-to strategies that we need that'll help them? So you'll see in this section on number 11, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about that in this session, but this one is around how do we prioritize and figure out what that long-term and short-term goals are for students when we're thinking about academic or behavior. We're talking about how do we design our instruction toward that learning goal? What is it that we need to adapt with the task or materials to help them meet the goal? And then we have to teach those cognitive and metacognitive strategies. We have to provide scaffolds. We use explicit instruction, and we do that through grouping. We can do that through engagement activities, through technology and assistive technology, that very intensive or direct instruction. And then we have to model how to help students maintain and learn, generalize what they've just learned across different classes or different settings. So if I teach them to use something in reading, how can they use that same strategy in social studies? And then the other one, the last one is, how do we give them positive and constructive feedback? Because it's so important for our students with disabilities. They are the students that need the most opportunity for practice and feedback, because they need multiple turns. Because sometimes our students either have, processing speed disorders, they have trouble with memory, they have trouble with chunking information. So those are things that we have to do to help model and help kids learn. So when we start thinking about high leverage practices and we're thinking about that instruction, ultimately our goal is, what supports do our students need in order to be successful? So we're going to look first at high leverage practice number 11. And so this is one of those things that we work on sometimes when we're goal writing for students. We're trying to look at lots of information that we have, both from our formal assessments, and then we have classroom formative assessments from the classroom. So we have our assessment data, formative assessments. We have all kinds of things that give us a clue about where students are performing at. So then we have to take that information, just as we do in that present level of performance. We also have to think about, how do we figure out what the priority is? What is the skill that students really, really need in order to be able to be successful? So when we think about the high leverage practice number 11, that's where we really think about prioritizing, or sometimes we call that filtering or funneling, to really get down to what it is, the skill deficit area, and how can we help improve that. So there's an example on the screen here for reading. So how do we, if we just say a student needs support in reading, we really need to know what area in reading that child needs the support. For example, is it a phonemic awareness issue? Is it, are they having trouble with the alphabetic principle, or is it a phonics issue? Are they having trouble with fluency? Because sometimes we'll write a fluency goal, but it's really that they maybe need help with phonics or phonemic awareness. So it's really drilling down to know, is it that, do they have mastery of all 26 letters and 44 sounds? Because if not, then we can look to see what letters they do know and then what sounds they know. So rather than it just being a fluency issue that a student might have, it's really a phonics issue. And so pinpointing that particular deficit can make such a difference for the work that we do with students. That's an area that we sometimes fall short in, is really being able to drill down. Because sometimes we have, like I said, we have all that formative data. We have that data from our formal assessments and the test. We have IQ scores, we have academic scores, so we still have all that data, but we still have to figure out how to break that down into a smaller chunks to really be able to figure out what that skill is for students. So we get a little hung up there, but so that's why it's so important that we figure out what those priorities are, and that helps us write our goals, that helps us progress monitor, and then that helps us choose the specially designed instruction we use. And then again, it's all that cyclical process with IEP. It's really about making sure we're teaching the kids the specific skills, and then we're assessing, did they get those, and do we need to try different strategies, and are we making improvements? The next one then let's talk about is example for writing. It's sometimes writing is one of the most difficult areas for us in special education to come up with a very drilled down skill area, because sometimes our students have trouble with the writing process, but sometimes our students may have trouble with written expression, and maybe they have trouble with letter formation. Maybe they have handwriting issues. Maybe they have issues with fluency, with writing fluency. So it's really important that we are able to drill down and figure out what that skill is, because it's different if students have trouble with in the writing process. That means they have a difficulty with things like pre-writing or planning for their writing or revising. And so if that's the case, those are skills that we teach them one at a time. For example, if we think about the strategy for pre-writing, we might use a graphic organizer to help them pre-write, and help them generate ideas for the writing piece that they're going to produce. And so if they we can give them a graphic organizer. So we first start with teaching them how to pre-write. Okay, so that may take a few lessons, because they have to think about, well, what's my topic? What are some ideas about that I'm going to write about? What is the task asking me to do? And then that's when you move into that planning. So they start thinking about, well, if I'm going to build a 5-paragraph essay, the first part has to be, how am I going to write a topic sentence? How do I identify three main components or details, and then how do I elaborate on that? But again, so it's important that we don't just say, okay, we write a goal and we are going to work on the writing process, but that we drill down and make sure that students know every section along the way. So we do know that that's effective in the research about how to prioritize that work. The same thing for science. So there's many components of science. Some of those things are prerequisite skills they need. Some things are procedural things. Some are being able to apply. We have cross-cutting standards. There are all kinds of different pieces in science that students might need to know. And the same thing for mathematics. If we break down mathematics, if it's, kids are going to have trouble adding and subtracting if they have difficulty with one-to-one correspondence. So in kindergarten, students need to be able to write their numbers to 20, for example. And so if they are having trouble even identifying, 1 is 1 and 2 is 1, 2, and 3 is 1, 2, 3, then they're going to have a difficulty adding and subtracting, even with regrouping. So we have to make sure that we drill down to that very discrete skill, and then we prioritize the learning. So for example, if I'm going to have a student move toward a goal of being able to add and subtract with 2-digit numbers, I first have to make sure that they know that one-to-one correspondence. So my goal may be that I want them to be able to do 2-digit addition and subtraction, but some of the short-term goals might be that I break that down and I make sure that I understand within 20 one-to-one correspondence. Again, you'll see we set those instructional goals based on what the standards are and the academic priorities. But then we have another level of that as special educators, is how do we differentiate that, or what's different or added on to that instruction to make that special for our student. Because we may have 6 students in a class and we may have some specially designed instruction that's not the same across for all 6 students. So again, that's another piece that we need to think about. Okay, so let's think about, it's kind of difficult again sometimes to think about how to prioritize those goals, but sometimes you can also think using screeners and other tools to help you pinpoint or narrow that down. You might use a writing prompt. You may do an assessment either in math with numbers to see if they know that one-to-one correspondence. You may do a quick phonics screener to see if they understand all 26 letters and 44 sounds. So next one is the high leverage practice number 12. And so this practice says that we design our instruction toward a very specific learning goal. So we're very systematic. And so we're thinking about what those goals look like. And again, we're thinking about this through the lens as a special educator. So we're thinking about how do we design our instruction to meet that specific learning goal. So the very first thing is we're going to look at what that criteria is. So let's see what clear criteria is for that learning goal. And then, so let's use an example. We can use a reading example. But if we're talking about rhyming words, and we want to design lessons to help students with working to be able to be successful with rhyming words, then we're going to have to decide what the criteria is. So how are we going to know if they understand rhyming words? Then we move to that, is it observable? What does that look like? If they're, how well I can observe or know what that goal is, if what that task is, so I can measure if they've mastered that goal or not. Can I measure it? Is it a positive goal? Is it linked to what we're doing in the general curriculum? And is that individualized? So you think about that whole process. It's very carefully thought out, and we're very methodical when we think about instruction, how we design our instruction to meet a goal. So that's what all of high leverage practice number 12 is, really reflecting and thinking about how do we design our instruction for that goal in mind. And again, that's sometimes part of that process we think about as we are thinking about what specially designed instruction does a student need? How do we make sure that they have what they need to be successful? This practice is how do we adapt to curriculum, task, and materials for specific learning goals. And so it's sometimes confusing about adapting for specific goals. So how can we adapt a assignment or a lesson or materials? We can do that by simplifying the task. We can reduce the amount of questions. We can alter the level of difficulty. For example, we can adjust the reading level if we're making sure that if we're asking students to be able to infer with a reading standard, but we could, so we maybe if they don't read on grade level, if they're a 4th grade student, but they only read on a 2nd grade level, then we can reduce the task down to the difficulty level for 2nd grade, and then allow students to be able to read that, right? So we can do those things with adapting task. The third one is content enhancement. How can we take guided notes? How can we use graphic organizers? How can we use mnemonics? Those were also things we were talking about with writing. You know, you can use graphic organizers like a hamburger, right? It helps you organize 5 paragraphs. Or if you're teaching students with to use ways to check for grammar and accuracy, then you can use a mnemonic or an organizer for that. So there are different ways that we can adapt for specific goals. So the next one, I'm going to stop and I'll talk just a little bit about explicit instruction. So this is the one that we really think is encompassing most of all of those other things. It includes some of the practices, the high leverage practice, such as number 15 around scaffolding. So really, when we think about explicit instruction, we always generally go to, that's our go-to for how we model and make those things very explicit and demonstrated for students that have disabilities. So the I do it, and we'll just talk a little bit about that. The I do it part is really where the teacher models that, what that explicit instruction looks like. So the I do it is where the teacher is very carefully planning and selecting instructional materials and resources and examples so that they model the thinking, the metacognitive strategy and the thinking about how do we think through how to solve the problem, or how do we think through the reading passage that we're reading, or how do we think through a procedural process. But the I do it part is very particular. It is very very explicitly modeled. And so we also are thinking about how do we provide examples and non-examples. And so sometimes when we think about designing a lesson, we get a little lost in the examples and non-examples, or it's difficult for us to come up with, you know, what something looks like or doesn't look like. And so when I talk about that with teachers, I think about how do we choose examples to provide that for students. So the I do it part is, so that's how we have to think through that, and we have to model that. And so I find that when I talk to teachers, or I work with teachers through explicit lessons, that we kind of get bogged down on that part. And so I even have been working with some pre-service teachers, but that's the part that they have trouble with, is the I do it. What do those examples look like, those non-examples? So that's a really important piece for our special education students. We teach them that thinking through that strategy. We do the think aloud, and we teach them to intentionally move through those. Now, on the teacher's perspective, we have to plan for those, and we have to make sure that we do those prior to that lesson, because sometimes it's very difficult to come up with examples and non-examples unless you plan for that in your lesson. So the I do it part is that really that thinking and modeling from the teacher, and then we shift to the we do it part. And so the we do it part is when we have examples, and we provide students with opportunities to join with us in the lesson and the learning by asking them questions and having them respond. And so here in the we do it part is when we can really have opportunities for students when we think about engagement. This is how we can use the tools that we have in our classroom for whiteboards. We have Kagan strategies that we use, but we think about how do we allow students to respond and be involved in the lesson. For example, if we have students that you want to demonstrate an example of what you want them to model, what a circle is, and draw radius, then you could have all students use a whiteboard and draw the circle and then represent what it looks like for radius. You may also have them draw what it looks like to represent for circumference. There are all kinds of things. You can do that in reading if you wanted them to highlight a particular component in the story, or if you wanted them to respond or answer a question around comprehension in the story. But what we do here is around that engagement. And when we think about that, engagement is high leverage practice 18. How do we make sure that we always have students responding when we're in the we do it part as we go through that lesson? So that's a piece that's kind of shifting the way we think about teaching and learning. And that allows us to think about how do we have all students engaged and responding in every component of the lesson. So that takes a little bit of planning and a little bit of thinking through in order to be able to do that effectively. And so in the you do it section is where you allow the students the opportunity to practice independently. And so if you'll remember back with high leverage practice before on working on like flexible grouping, that's high leverage practice 17, and that's back in our list, and you can find those in your book as well. But we're thinking about how do we group kids? How do we have kids work together? How can we provide supports? And because sometimes when we get to the you do it part and we allow students to work independently, we find that the scaffolds, or they need some more support, or they need more examples and non-examples. So there's where we have to think about how do we switch back very quickly to the we do it, or how do we switch back to the I do it part, and we give them more instruction around modeling that lesson. Because sometimes we tell our students, and we give them that instruction, and then we give them that level of support, then we give them the independent opportunity to do that independently, and they can't do it. So when we think and plan lessons, we have to be fluid in that. And we have to know that there's always opportunities for us to move back and example, maybe model a lesson in a different way. So you can see that really when we talk about the explicit instruction and think about that high leverage practice, when we think about that specially designed instruction, we always as special educators choose specially designed instruction or explicit instruction, or those are part of those menu of services that we have in that specially designed instruction. So that's really what that means. And it encompasses many of the high leverage practices. So when we deliver explicit instruction or direct instruction, we're really adding in many of those practices. So it's probably things we're already doing as educators, but we are just don't realize that's what we call that. So that's another thing to think about when we think about that those types of instructional strategies. So that is kind of at the end of our session, and I will, but I want to scroll over here to this page, and it is high leverage practices for inclusive classrooms. And I want to put that on the screen for you to be able to take a look at. and talk just a little bit about what those are. So you can see this is a great resource. You can see that the Council of Exceptional Children provided this resource for us with the Cedar Foundation, but it gives you the background about why the tool, why this document was created, who the authors were, and the team that helped develop those practices. And I won't scroll too quickly here, but I just wanted you to be able to see the contents of this book. And so this is a great book. I know that this time of the year, we're really thinking about, closing out the year. We're thinking about time, practicing and working with students in areas to reinforce skills. But here's the research and the thinking behind each of those big areas in high leverage practices. And I would suggest that you use this book as you start thinking about and planning for even the next school year. So as the summer and we're thinking about, what is that going to look like in our practices for next year, then this is a great resource to have. And I'll just kind of scroll just a little bit to show you a couple things in here. And this is really about the development and the history of where that came from, as far as high leverage practices. But you'll see that there's the research that says, these are practices for effective special ed teachers. And so, you'll see that box in the center. It talks about special education teachers being problem solvers. And so we have to have such a diversity in skill. We have to be able to collaborate. We have to be able to assess students. We have to be able to provide instruction. We have to be able to help students with social, emotional, behavioral supports. And so this kind of helps give us the research behind that and the knowledge about what that looked like in that classroom. But I will just give you one more idea, and you can see it'll share with you the high leverage practices. And so everything everything that's connected here is really about how is this relevant to you in your classroom, and what's the important things that's going to occur frequently and most have the greatest impact for your students. But you'll see all the way through, you'll see all of those things around each one of the areas with collaboration and assessment, social emotional practices. But I wanted to stop right here and talk about instruction, because that's one of the most important things that we have. And it's really around our practice, using evidence-based practices, using data, and in order to design and deliver instruction to move students. And so recently we looked at the data for our region around proficiency rates for students with disabilities. And what we're finding is that our students are predominantly scoring novice or apprentice in assessments with both accommodations and modifications. So what we know is just solely modifications and accommodations are not providing students with enough support. So then we have to kind of look internally at what are we doing with instruction? What does specially designed instruction look like? And how can we continue to support that in our planning and delivery of how we teach, the teaching and learning that happens every day. So you'll see all of those high leverage practices are here in this book. This is very important to know because those are all aligned with the standards that we have as professionals in special education, because the Council for Exceptional Children have standards for special educators. And so these are aligned with that work. So there are things that are expected for us as special educators. And so I think that's a good thing to know, that we have professional standards for education, for special education, and to be able to find and know what those are. And then if you're teaching in their classroom and you're using a strategy and someone asks, are those evidence-based strategies, then you know where to go to and think about, yes, so these have been identified as a high leverage practice in special education. Okay, so we will stop for today. That link for this recorded session will be in the Exceptional Children's site at theholler.org, and both the PowerPoint presentation and the digital books for high leverage practices will also be available to you that you can have access to. So if you have any questions, you'll see on the screen, this is our Special Education Regional Technical Assistance Center staff with links and emails so that you can contact us if you have any questions. And we thank you, and we hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.